I am going to attempt basically a high-level, fast-paced kind of summary, starting with, for the first 10 years of this project, what did we really do? We put together 3 foundational data sets. We published 3 key papers. And then most of the time I'm going to spend on what are we doing at the moment and where are we looking to head in the future. So I guess this talk kind of was put together mostly for my own purposes, because I found my thinking running away on many different directions because so many different things have happened. And I've tried to classify what we are doing with Madagascar grasses. There are pretty much 3 different directions we're doing at the moment. So there's landscape work, which is for conservation and for carbon and for climate. There's weed work, which is for crops and for agri-systems. And there's livestock and pasture work, which is to help pastures animal production. And these all interlink. Okay, I've successfully changed slide. Excellent. So foundation number 1. I started working here back in 2011. And I'm a taxonomist, I really started working on all of the grasses, and I had a look, like, where is grass taxonomy needed around the world? We have had an office in Madagascar and a presence in Madagascar since the mid-80s, and nobody has ever attempted a flora of Madagascar. So French botanists based in Paris had been describing many species over the years, but they use the French herbarium and they compare it to the floras of places that used to be part of the French Empire. So all of these French type specimens and names were never really compared to the flora of tropical East Africa, Flora zambesiaca, which was done here in Kew. They were never compared to the flora of South Africa, which is really similar. So off I went to MNHN, the Paris Herbarium. The way I structured this talk is every slide is going to have a picture of the main collaborators. People who are not from Kew have their institutional affiliation after them. I may have remembered to include a little logo of their institution and also some information on the main funding bodies where we've had significant grants. So foundation 1, personally from me, I spent, Tamar Hivermans, who many people know today, here, he's running the Flora of Madagascar funded initiative at the Paris Herbarium, and I spent a month there at some point, and we go there basically working through the specimens, publishing taxonomic treatments. Okay, so then foundation number 2, we went to Madagascar, and it rapidly became obvious that all of these Malagasy grasses that were described in the Paris Herbarium, in Madagascar, nobody knew about them. And the Malagasy Professional Botanical Body, basically, it's a bit of a, and that's the case, I think, in many tropical countries where it's a tree-centered culture and a flower-centered culture, where people do vegetation assessments based on big, bright, showy things. They identify those. And when I first went to Madagascar in 2011, basically grasslands were assumed to be boring, anthropogenic, and irrelevant. Nobody was looking at the grasses. So my first thanks go to Helen Raleigh-Manana and Professor Yari Janode at the University of Antananarivo, who supervised together with me our first Madagascar-based postgraduate research student. So Nanjerisu Onanj, who many of you know today, she went to the Tremor protected area, and we published a checklist of that, supported by the National Geographic. Then soon after, Nancy started, and she collected, again, all the grasses of the Ishallo protected area. Those are the, I'm not going to walk around and wave my arms because I'm told I have to be near this microphone. So under the blue lines that you see on the map is all the bits of Madagascar where I've been over the first 10 years. So we managed to find pretty much half of the flora, which is a really good achievement because similarly to all tropical floras, and especially grasses, the common species are very common, but more than half of the species list are obscure, difficult to find, may or may not exist, and have never been taxonomically revised. So we're going to come back to that later. Then the arrow on top is our new collaboration with the University of Majunga. So August was here last year, and he supervised 3 MSc students locally to also do a decent local grass survey. So this kind of killed many birds with one stone, because we started accumulating like lived personal knowledge of what do these species look like in the field, accumulating herbarium specimens, collecting silica gel data, and most importantly, accumulating Malagasy professional network lived experience of what these plants are and how to connect them to historical legacy of knowledge that we hold in Europe and in the UK. Okay, so that should be foundation 3. That's the first area that we're discovering in this presentation. About halfway through these first 10 years, we started gathering plot-based data because it rapidly became apparent that herbarium specimens, they're great, but they're not really enough to answer ecological questions to do with presence and absence. Like, ecologists need to know what is absent as well as what's present. So the initial premise was really very simple. In any one given place, what grasses are there and which grasses can we guarantee are not there? And over the years, this has grown to be called the Global Grassy Group. Some professional ecologists got on board around 2016, so 5 years after project start. The key person who I'll be mentioning a lot is Caroline Lehman, who's now our core collaborator at the University of Edinburgh and Royal Botanic Gardens, Edinburgh. She now runs the Global Grassy Group. You're seeing an advanced modern version of our plot sampling protocol, which has gotten simpler and slicker and sort of more compatible with ecological statistics. And you're seeing a screenshot of the website. Okay, so 3 foundation papers that we did initially. I'm sure I'm still quite sad that Jan's not with us here anymore. This paper was actually published by Jan before he first came to Kew. Many of these early trips I did together with Guillaume Besnard are from Toulouse. All the DNA data that we accumulated, actually it was a syntax grant that's on the next slide that paid for them all to be sequenced here in Kew. And we made a list of evolutionary radiations of Poaceae that went into Madagascar from various places. And we discovered that grasses colonized Madagascar at least 71 times, probably more. And grasses came to Madagascar mostly around 5 million years ago, during the time when the global savanna biome was being assembled all around the world. So in the slide, every little line is a radiation of grasses to Madagascar, an evolutionary jump. And the black ones are C4. And that gives us pretty much absolute proof that grass evolution in Madagascar happened in open canopy ecosystems, which contradicts, like the story often told about Madagascar is it was covered in forests before people came. Then people arrived, they destroyed the whole thing to create the grasslands. Okay, so second foundation paper is when we first started using the plots. So the black blobs you see in Madagascar is our very first simple plot data set that actually Peter Linder came out with me and helped me put together back in 2014. Then Felix calculated phylogenetic diversity. We did some mapping with Justin. We did a systematic comparison of Madagascar's floristic data to Africa's floristic data. And basically Madagascar looks normal, and Madagascar's grasslands and grassy flora looks normal on all the standard statistical parameters that we use to look at African savannas, South American savannas. Okay, so foundation paper number 3, we were lucky to have an incredible PhD student supervised together with Caroline, who's called Cedric. And this is the second part of her PhD thesis. she went and did lots and lots of plots in grasslands in central Madagascar, and she applied. So one theme that you're going to see coming up again and again in this talk is African savannas and grasslands are quite well understood and taxonomy is well done across southern tropical Africa. So I've been trying to, I guess, harness that knowledge, expertise, people and things and apply them to Madagascar. Because historically, both the francophone history of science in Madagascar and also kind of the insular nature of science in Madagascar meant that that hadn't really been done before. Like we tend to find that people who specialize in Madagascar, it's a really resource and thought intensive and emotion intensive thing. Like things become all about Madagascar and it's difficult to add insights from the outside. So Cedric applied some of the expectations we have for the African savanna. And sure enough, in Madagascar, we have fire-maintained grasslands, which are flammable. All of these grasses tend to have traits that encourage fires, build fires, make a positive feed-forward loop with fires, and they take away dicots and tree seedlings that can't handle those specific kind of fires. And the second alternative, also similar to South Africa, grazing maintained grassland, palatable grasses, which tends to be a very different kind of grass with different traits. So they're the ones that are creeping. They're the ones that, like those grazing grasses, they specifically make leaves and culms for animals to eat them. Then the grazers come, and it's a different kind of disturbance-driven sort of ecosystem creation and maintenance. The grazer comes, it eats the grass, and the plants that can't handle it get selected out. And there you have what we call a grazing lawn. So all these grazing long grasses are also a strong indication that before people brought livestock and zebu, it's very likely there were ancient herbivores in Madagascar, maybe hippos, maybe different kinds of elephant birds, large tortoises that would have been grazing these grasses before people arrived. Okay, so all of this proved quite controversial. So in a way, and it's both interesting and frustrating at the same time because it gave us an opportunity to engage with so many different disciplines of inquiry and think about things. But the debate in the literature about whether Madagascar grasslands are native or not has also gotten a bit toxic. And I came to be a little bit I guess for me, it highlighted the binary nature of people's thinking about tropical ecosystems. So a lot of conservation planners and other colleagues, it's very black and white. Like if we look at a patch of ground in Madagascar, either it's natural or it's anthropogenic, right? And if it's natural, it's good and must be protected and there's good biodiversity. And if it's anthropogenic, it's bad and conservation isn't applicable and we have to do reforestation in that place, which is an incredibly limiting and narrow way of looking at things. So before I get into our current projects and Kew contribution, there's just a couple of sort of intermediate slides about what kind of progress, what are we doing about this question. Leanne Phelps on this slide, who's working with Caroline Lehman in Edinburgh, she basically did a global analysis of all fire regimes, and she demonstrated that fire regimes we see in modern Madagascar are pretty much normal for these kinds of tropical ecosystems. They're the same as we see in tropical Africa. So the constant moral panic that we have in Madagascar about fires, it's not exactly not justified. Like fires are a very difficult issue, and fires have many different issues associated with them. But it's not true to say that these fires are unnatural, and it's not true to say that these fires are completely different from Africa. On the right of the slide, you see the new IUCN ecosystem typology, where Caroline and colleagues succeeded getting that recognized by the IUCN. So you see a lot of Madagascar is red, which is the fire-driven Madagascar grasslands. Okay, and we had basically 5 active postdoctoral researchers in 5 different disciplines assemble the Malagasy grass biomes group. And in 2021, we had a really big online meeting If you go to the YouTube channel, we still have presentations up there by everybody who participated. So to broaden and to deepen this discourse, to find out more things, to make the research more equitable, we try to find who's working on this area, like anthropologists and sociologists and ecologists and paleontologists and everybody really. And after that, Leanne pulled together. So we are currently working on a summary paper, which is dealing first with terminology. So I don't know how much you can read on the slide, but the pink circle is a very confusing word, woodland, because sometimes woodland is what functional ecology considers to be a closed canopy forest, and sometimes it's a fire-driven savanna. And a lot of this sort of negativity in misunderstandings and arguments around this is also because we work in 3 different languages in Madagascar. So how do we know whether it's treeless grassland, is a savanna, is it a woodland? What does that really mean? And how do we transition from the traditional physiognomic, I suppose, because we used to classify ecosystems by what they looked like. So before, the terminology is all about, can we see trees? Can we see shrubs? And nowadays, ecologists are trying to transition to, well, how does it function? What drives the ecosystem? So these modern words are no longer just about how it looks, but we can't always understand how it functions without studying it first. And for a lot of Madagascar, we still don't know, for example, Western Madagascar, to what extent is it a fire-driven ecosystem historically? Nobody knows that. Okay, so now we're going to do current projects during the pandemic, what we're doing right now, and particularly the Kew contribution on those things, because it expanded quite a lot, and I'm not going to attempt to cover what everybody else is leading on in other institutions. So the majority of that work that I've spoken about is ecological. And we've been contributing here. So George Tiley spent 2 years here on his Marie Curie Fellowship, co-supervised with Ilya Leach, and that built also on molecular work supervised by Mike Fay. And so the key contributions being genetics, genomics, population genetics, landscape genomics, together with Roberta, who helped on the RADseq, and Joe also helped us supervise Chana's PhD. So there is, the center of Madagascar basically has one grass, Lutetia simplex, which defines the ecosystem. It's not exactly monodominant, but it's the most common and it's the most notable. And we did a sequence of microsatellite-based phylogenetics, population genetics to start with. Then we did angiosperm 353. George is now analyzing RADseq. We're assembling a genome to try and get a proper handle on what the polyploid genome dynamics are doing. George taught a course here and also up in Edinburgh on how to take apart polyploid genomics, because of course here, like, we do a lot of excellent genomics now, but the thing about genomics is everything is based on diploid organisms, because people and most animals are diploid, and Lutetia simplex is we think hexaploid, so it's got 6 copies of its genome, which makes the maths a little bit inconvenient. And the picture is clear. The further away from one another these Lutetia are, the more genetically distant they are. It looks like there was a single colonization into Madagascar. Historic literature says that these grasslands are anthropogenic because they say, oh, look, this grassland isn't endemic to Madagascar. And you can see on the map exactly where this grass occurs in Africa and in Madagascar. So we have the same, and because through application of taxonomic methods, Chana looked at this question in quite a lot of detail. So we reviewed the taxonomic history, and actually Lutetia simplex is really similar to the blue stem, big blue stem in the North American prairies. So it's a kind of polyploid grass where locally adapted populations acquire different traits, acquire their own little niche characteristics. And there's morphological variability all over the place. But a polyploid complex like this, which Frank White called occlospecies at Oxford University many years ago, um, taxonomy, like we have space to call it, it can all be one species, or we can separate it out in about 20 different morphotypes, subspecies. So in Europe and in North America, often these kinds of things are separated into many different things with different Latin names. The tradition of African taxonomy is sort of more general, where we tend to lump all diversity together, just for simplicity's sake, because there are fewer people and fewer resources, and a lot more spatial and genetic diversity tends to be within a single species in Africa. So we decided to leave Lutetia simplex, so the same Latin name for Africa and in Madagascar. But we know that it arrived in Madagascar maybe 500 million years ago at least. And there's a few more papers coming up on that. How am I doing for time? Okay, not too bad. And this is, I think, the first Kew announcement of our new project funded by the GCBC, Global Center on Biodiversity for Climate. Joe and Adam, do you want to wave there? Okay, thank you. So really the science basis for this project was developed by Adam and by Joe. Joe is a postdoctoral FLFMP1, and Joe, you made the first ever map model of what might be kind of the ancient grass map of central Madagascar. And here it is in yellow on the map. All the little yellow circles are plot data points that we already have. The triangles are places where we want to study reforestation. So the idea behind this project is to sort of turn this slightly toxic argument about Madagascar grasses, take our professional ecological expertise and everything we learned, and actually apply it productively towards planning of tree planting, because everywhere across the tropics, certainly in Madagascar, there's a very large investment in planting trees and in reforestation, and finance is pouring into that as carbon offsets. This is also with Caroline in Edinburgh. This is also together with the Global Biodiversity Standard, which is run by Paul Smith and represented by the Missouri Botanical Garden in Madagascar. We're going to look at all of these grasslands and try to model 3 different types, like which ones are really secondary, and where are the good places to plant trees, like which bits are protected from fire, where are the tree seedlings and saplings actually going to survive, because Madagascar can be, some people say that Madagascar is a history, is a graveyard of development projects and graveyard of tree planting projects. So trees get planted, they burn down, they don't grow to maturity, trees get planted again. And we'd like to contribute to basically, instead of perpetuating that cycle, actually growing trees in the correct places. We want to find out where is carbon really sequestered by old growth Malagasy grasslands, because there's often an assumption that if it's a forest, there's a lot of carbon there, and if it's a grassland, there isn't. So this is also linked to another project that we're running together with James Burrell and Paul Wilkin. It's a DEFRA Biodiversity Landscape Fund initiative in Madagascar, where Adam and other colleagues, we are doing plots, and we're also collaborating with ESSA for a RLI, another part of the University of Antananarivo, to really properly measure underground carbon and delimit the grasslands that already have carbon under the ground, because underground carbon is very difficult, expensive, and time-heavy thing to really assess. So existing carbon estimates across Africa too, and across the world, not just in Madagascar, when carbon under the ground isn't taken into account, all the carbon finance goes sideways, and we can't understand carbon balances anyway without understanding nitrogen, without understanding what happens more generally with our ecosystem. And this is sort of my part and more the taxonomic part of the new GCBC project, which is in order to make better models of different kinds of grassy ecosystems in Madagascar, we need a list of species, like what's really in those grasslands. What you see in this picture is actually a place near Majunga, which is one of the controversial questions. So everybody my colleagues in Majunga, it's assumed to be an anthropogenic secondary ecosystem because it burns and it has grasses in it. But other colleagues who've looked at it, they say, oh, well, that's a classic palm savanna. And you see some dicotyledonous plants, you see the palms, there's quite a bit of floristic diversity in there. So what we're trying to find a way of doing for this project is in all the plots and all across Madagascar, we want to take all the flora of Madagascar and separate out which one might be. So we run into the problem with the concept of grasslands. We're looking sort of at open canopy ecosystems broadly. So Pete Phillipson and Sylvie and the Missouri Botanical Gardens, they run a web system called the Madagascar Catalog, and they previously already assessed habitats of the different Madagascar species one by one. They did a systematic literature assessment. But of course, if you do the assessment and if you do your taxonomy, without thinking that grasslands really exist as an ecosystem, a lot of our grassland plants, they appear in the system like they're rocky plants or plants of rocky outcrops, or maybe they're plants of swamps, or like they're plants of coastal areas, or so. And I've come to realize that it's an issue actually of compatibility between disciplines, because many of us, and I've also contributed to the Flora of Tropical East Africa as a flora writing taxonomist. Like, as taxonomists, we write something about habitats of our plants, but we don't think about the ecological classification. And then ecologists have no way of making a list of grassland or savanna plants, because often for many tropical parts of the world, of course, there is no complete flora. Um, for the flora of Madagascar has never been written. No, even the flora of Madagascar poaceae, our 500 or 600 grasses, nobody's attempted a flora of Madagascar poaceae. So working from literature, data, and herbarium specimens, I mean, how do you separate your flora into forests versus outside forests? Don't know. So we'll be running a series of events and interaction exercises and herbarium sorts. And we'll be issuing a call also to all taxonomic specialists on different plant groups to help us figure out like exactly what palms might be in open ecosystem areas, which aloes, which euphorbias. And as part of this project, this is like the fun fieldwork exploration site. In addition to the 3 easily accessible sites for soil work, we're going to look at the lost forest of Ivohuboro, which I anticipate will be especially interesting for endemic grasslands and old growth grassland diversity. So by far the largest number of endemic grasses anywhere in Madagascar is the famous Andringitra Massif and the Andringitra Plateau, which is very close to that arrow that you see here. And so Ivohuboro, I think I ran out of time to put all of the logos in, but they're partly looked after by Misette and by Valbio, by Patricia Wright, and all the community in Madagascar that are centered around lemur conservation. Like, I've come to learn that science in Madagascar, like if it's about lemurs, it happens and it's reasonably well funded. And if it's not about lemurs, it's kind of harder. So this will be our chance to work with lemur specialists, and also the Phoenix Conservancy, who conserve the Palouse Prairie in the US. So they already understand perennial fire-driven grasslands, and they developed a different kinds of tree planting reforestation method there called foxhole forests that we can assess and look at the carbon storage. Okay, so that was at the end of our current projects to do with ecosystems and conservation. Now this is my category of what are we trying to do to help crops. And in order to help crops, it was quite obvious that we need to look at weeds. Agriculturally, many of the most damaging weeds are grasses. We are now in the final year of our Royal Society project, which is centered on Madagascar's worst weeds. So the genus Digitaria. Digitarias are all really similar to one another, and they tend to throw up quite aggressive weeds every now and again across the revolutionary tree. If anybody looks at plants in London, Digitaria sanguinalis in East London and near Kew is currently rapidly expanding. It's got the classic digitate inflorescence. You may have walked past it on the pavement. It's part of the British flora influx of so European Mediterranean weedy genotypes from France and from Spain are rapidly going north across southern England. And this project is our first attempt to classify the ones in Madagascar. So Lorna spent 2 years in Kew KABaM, in Paris Herbarium, and working with Nancy, and Fenitra also ought to be on this slide. Really doing, this is a very traditional kind of, we look at thousands and thousands of herbarium specimens in Madagascar, and Lorna systematically compared them to the ones we have from East Africa, the ones we have from Southern Africa, in the bid, and we use micromorphological characteristics. Like, so we take apart what's the lower glume, what's the upper glume, how many veins do they have, what kind of hairs are there in the spaces between the veins, and where are those hairs positioned. So an awful lot of microscopy. The plant dissections that you see on this slide are drawn by Nancy or Nantanina, and she's also our botanical artist in Kew, Madagascar. She has drawn absolutely amazing botanical plates for all kinds of grasses. So bear in mind the one spikelet, which is most of the objects you see on there, it's maybe about 1 to 2 millimeters long on average. So all of this has to take place down a dissecting microscope. And previously, this kind of work wasn't possible in Madagascar at all, because the kind of microscope you need to see these veins and these glooms properly, well, there simply weren't microscopes like that in the herbarium or the university in Madagascar, which means that no matter how much you might want to do this work in Madagascar, it's impossible. And of course, the Malagasy National Herbarium also doesn't have type specimens, or in fact, any specimens of a good number of the endemics. So we are going to submit this taxonomic revision soon. And what I try to do in the slides is try to formulate like the core scientific key takeaway message. What did we find? And we found that the previous generation of African taxonomists here were actually wrong. So in the Kew KABaM sequence, many Malagasy species were informally put in with the East African species to suggest that they're going to go into the synonymy. But when Lorna and I took them apart in detail, we found that actually the majority of them, they're distinct in Madagascar. So we're seeing more and more radiations into Madagascar from Africa, including some of the more vicious weeds. But the radiations are sufficiently old, and there's been enough diversification morphologically that they're clearly different species in Madagascar. So also, this project was our first collaboration with FAFIFA, which is the National Agricultural Research Institute in Madagascar. And this is our, please excuse my terrible French accent, malherbologue, weed scientist, Jean Augustin, and together with Philippa, we supervise the MSc research of Fenitra. So Fenitra is actually arriving in Kew tomorrow, and here to start her PhD. She won the highest possible distinction for this MSc work. So you see her here recording with a dictaphone. She traveled around central Madagascar and showed grassy weeds to people and talked to them about, well, what kind of grasses are in their cultivation and what are they used for? And overall, like, what's their impression of the interaction between grasses and people? And as you see, so her paper's about to come out on Plants, People, Planet. And the gray bars are what we're calling developmental constraint, which is the bad thing. So overall, we found that the farmers we've spoken to across the Central Highlands, um, this finding is completely in line with previous research done overall in other places in Madagascar. The weed load and the damage to crops is a bigger problem than any benefit that people derive from using them as foragers or for building, for medicinal purposes. And this links into another project we finished a few years ago, funded by GBIF, where we compiled all the data on Madagascar grasses and we drafted a national strategy for the Madagascar government to do with invasive and weedy plants. Because most countries in the world have like a list of plants they don't want, plants that you shouldn't import, weedy plants that are reportable. And we use the South African example, and basically to understand that Malagasy government has a lot of very urgent things to do. So weed lists and weed control just isn't something anybody had ever even thought about doing. So one concluding part of this project in the final year that I'm trying to organize now is we're using the South African forbidden plant lists and weed lists to understand what are going to be the next weed dangers in Madagascar. For example, pampas grass, Orchideria celoana, the big things with fluffy panicles that are often grown in people's front gardens in London and in the UK. They're a massive and very dangerous weed problem in many parts of the world. And for the first time, they have been imported to Antananarivo in the decorative trade. So I feel that the least we can do in this Royal Society project is let the Malagasy authorities know that they need to be careful with this plant import and basically give people a bit of a weed list and a weed strategy so that we can prevent the problem from getting worse. I didn't include a slide on this, but the funniest grass weed we found is called mahabanki, which in Malagasy means the bankruptcy weed, which is Ischimum rugosum. So it was bad enough that when it started invading people's fields, they called it bankruptcy weed. Um, okay, oh gosh, I'm not doing very well for time, so I'll try and go faster. So thank you, Rafael, for also being here today. Rafael Almeida is working on this project, putting together. We are about to publish a photographic guide to the species of grasses. So the previous book was only about genera, and now we're collecting all the photos we have. We did a hilarious field trip where in the picture you see portrait photography for grasses rather than people. So we built a little miniature photography studio in Fandriana, and we took some pictures, which you're going to see in the book. And David, who's hopefully also arriving from KMCC, is our professional photographer that we have on staff. So he was also incredible for providing training and contributing his photos. So this is actually the last part of my talk and the last part of what we're trying to do is the connection to livestock livelihoods and the Darwin Project. We're now in the very final year of the Darwin Project. And I try to summarize the logic of the project in this slide. So zebu cattle are really an essential part of Malagasy heritage. And what we realized had happened in the last maybe 50 years and since independence is the Malagasy government doesn't really realize the value of traditional livestock pastures. But in fact, feeding zebu better and increasing the grazing pressure can increase the diversity of our grasses and fertilization provided by the livestock. So I had to get a little bit into agriculture last few years. It was really good fun. So I learned the importance of manure and manure actually having the potential to convert in a fairly long-term way the ecology of grasslands. So it turns out that in sub-Saharan Africa, in a place, if people kept cattle somewhere 5,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, that part of the savanna grassland still has different fertility properties, different floristic properties. It's a completely different ecosystem. And grasslands are fundamentally disturbance driven ecosystems in their nature. So tweaking grasslands to a bit more how they were when there were more animals there also helps us control fire, because when we have more nutritious grasses and we have more grazing pressure, guess what? It removes the fuel. When you have less fuel, there are less fires, and then the forests that we're trying to protect, for example, in a tram, don't get damaged as much. So we also recently found out that we were successful for a UKRI grant together with the Institute of Development Studies and Amber Huff, if anybody knows her. So we'll be looking at sort of the socio-economic structure of livestock smallholder systems in South Africa, and we'll have a staff member in Madagascar to try and bring kind of Madagascar at least a little bit of South African knowledge and expertise to Madagascar.